And welcome to Fossil Free California's Climate Finance Summit. We have an exciting day of sessions on the topics of moving your money out of fossil fuels, legislation and fiduciary duty, and litigation, taking big oil to court. I'm happy to see everyone here, and we will switch over to our first session now, Move Your Money. Our moderator for the first session is David Peaty. He's co-team lead with Indivisible Berkeley's Economic Justice team. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. I want to acknowledge my co-lead, Steve Murphy, who will be helping out throughout the session with note cards for Q&As. If at any point you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and Steve will try to get a card to you. I don't think we have pens or pencils for everyone, so we're hoping that...
I have a few extra pens, but hopefully they brought their own.
Okay. And we'll have sort of two sessions of Q&A. And if you have a question specifically for one of our panelists, please say who it's for. If it's sort of a general question, we'll just try to address it at the appropriate time. So Indivisible is a movement that probably many of you are familiar with in response to the tragedy of November of 2016. And Indivisible Berkeley really had a strong response. It's quite a large branch. It's not technically a branch, but a unit of the Indivisible movement. And there are a number of teams with Indivisible Berkeley, and there was a group of us who were very interested in money and the role that it can play in both furthering devastation and tragedy, and also how it can be used for creating a just and peaceful and positive world. And so the Economic Justice team was formed, and we decided the very first thing that we wanted to do was to work with the city of Berkeley to divest from or separate from Wells Fargo, with whom they have been banking for years and years and years. It's not an easy thing to do. It's great to have the will to do it, and it's something that the city and the task force on responsible financing is still working to sort of figure out the details on how to do it. And for those of you who are here with the Alliance for Public Banking of Oakland, that's an integral part of, I think, the long-term solution about how we and cities and other institutions are going to be able to invest and handle finances in a super responsible way. So if you are interested in the efforts to get a public bank in Oakland, feel free to talk to me or any of the people from the Alliance afterwards, so thank you for that. My first responsibility is to introduce Cheryl Davila, and she sent me a wonderful bio, but I'd like to just proceed by just saying she's one of the most righteous people I know, straightforward talker, and I think she's very much appreciated for that. So she was tired of being tired and not being represented. Cheryl answered the call for regular, ethical people to be a part of the change they want to see made. She ran for city council of Berkeley in District 2, beat the 12-year incumbent, and was an estimation leading to victory. Councilmember Cheryl Davila stepped up, spoke up, rose up, and will continue to address the climate emergency we face, and will continue to fight for what's right for the community and for the city at large. Cheryl Davila.
Thank you. Welcome everyone and good morning. I'm Cheryl Davila, District 2 representative for the City of Berkeley. I'm happy to represent the constituents of District 2 and all the people in our wonderful city. I'm honored and humbled to be here today. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for being here. And thank you for Fossil Free California. How many folks in the room went to the Climate Action, Jobs, and Justice March on Saturday? Wasn't that inspiring? Let's give that a round of applause. What a perfect day. The speakers, the murals were spectacular, the weather was the reason why I live in this amazing state. And indigenous spiritual leaders created an atmosphere that all the beautiful people of all colors and ages and sizes were in the march, seemingly ready to unite and recognizing our connectivity to each other, the earth, and the land. Saturday was what climate mobilization looks like. Over 30,000 marching for climate justice and jobs. We all know that climate change is here, and we are experiencing the effects in California and throughout the world. Carolinas are about to get hit right now. Our office put forth to the city of Berkeley, who unanimously voted for a climate emergency declaration and a fossil fuel-free city resolution last June 2012. The climate emergency declaration began by a Google search of climate emergency. Actually done by my son, who is pretty amazing. And he talked me into being the champion for climate in Berkeley. And it was a hard argument, but he convinced me, and I was like, okay, he's so passionate that this is something that my office did want to take on. And we were successful. Together with our mayor, our major mayor, Jesse Aragine, and Councilwoman Kate Harrison and Sophie Hahn, we hosted the Climate Emergency Regional Town Hall for the Bay Area with local elected officials, mayors, city councils, sustainability officers, and environmental justice organizations on Friday, August 24th at the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley. Who was there? Raise your hand. Yeah, not that many, but it was just an amazing, amazing event. The town hall began with Karina Gould, a spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of Lejeune, or Ohlone, and co-director of the Sogorea Te Land Trust, opened by grounding the day. The keynote speakers was Los Angeles Councilmember Paul Koretz, whose office has created a climate mobilization department with $500,000 to fund it so far. And Dr. Paloma Pavel, president of the Earth House Center, who stood in for Carl Anthony, who wasn't able to make it that day due to illness. Crystal Chisel of Project Drawdown, Michelle Swan from Movement Generation, Patrick Brown from Stanford to talk about the climate science, and the scientist who urges us to recognize our current climate models are giving us too liberal of a carbon budget. Andre Soto of Communities for Better Environment and many others, including elected officials and sustainability officers around the 8 of the 9 Bay Area counties. So we had about 12 counties in the region represented. The 9 counties represents 101 cities in the Bay. So we were pretty well represented. And our vision is to energize the 9 counties in a World War II scale mass mobilization on climate, enacting a just transition for people, earth, and diversity, and successfully enacting a Project Drawdown. Now we have the ad hoc subcommittee in the city of Berkeley on the climate emergency, and we've been working hard, and our next steps are about to begin, partnering with the environmental justice organizations, other elected officials, faith leaders, based on faith-based organizations, schools, all community members, businesses, to sit at a table and mobilize and educate our residents, UC Berkeley communities, the city, neighborhood groups, and all the communities to prepare for the climate emergencies that we face, and agreeing to a prototyping this regional mobilization until we get the state and the country and the world on board. Who's ready to do that? We're sending a letter to the governor and the incoming candidates that have, so far we have 35 elected officials signed on And they believe that protecting our communities, restoring a safe and stable climate, establishing a fair, resilient green economy will require mobilization on this scale and timeline. This level of mobilization is necessary to eliminate the fossil fuel consumption, greenhouse gas emissions across the sectors, draw down excess carbon, and to protect all the people and species from the consequences of abrupt climate change. In an age of increasing inequality, we must ensure just transitions, with leadership communities most vulnerable to the impacting environmental harms and detailed technical climate justice implementation plans, which have been prepared in partnership and thoroughly vetted by these communities. We urge Jerry Brown to take decisive action at GCAS by committing to declare climate emergencies in jurisdictions throughout the state and all levels of government, including California, and by committing immediately to initiate a rapid just mobilization effort to, one, halt the development of fossil fuel. Say amen to that one. Amen. Right? To enact immediate steps to draw down carbon from our atmosphere and to implement a just transition to resilience green economy, moving rapidly to zero emissions, 100% renewable energy, and the right to unionize, protections for displaced workers, and investments in communities impacted by the loss of fossil fuel jobs. To invest in just and equitable resiliency, disaster preparedness, and recovery efforts led in partnership with indigenous and frontline communities. Together with EJ organizations, elected officials, and others, we are going to organize a 2019 summit to gather everyone to collaborate on how we can move faster together. Faster together, isn't that the way we need to go?
Yeah.
The town hall demonstrated as a regional collaboration is possible. One of the outcomes of the town hall is to get other cities to commit to declaring climate emergencies and to be fossil fuel free cities, and to declare fossil fuel free resolutions in their jurisdictions and other municipalities. So if you can get your elected officials to do that, just start harassing them and sending them emails, and you can go to our ad hoc subcommittee website page and get the links to the declaration and the resolution to forward to your elected official. The Climate Emergency Declaration and Fossil Fuel Free Council items represented a vital proactive step to completely address climate change in our community and beyond. Thanks to Richmond City Council member Eduardo Martinez, Richmond has declared a climate emergency on August 4th. And I understand the mayors of Cupertino, Long Beach, Culver City, Lancaster, and Albany are also interested in doing this climate emergency declaration in the near future. Los Angeles, am I missing? Yeah, I went to the wrong page, excuse me. I get a little nervous doing these things. Who knows if Berkeley divested in fossil fuels?
Oh,
They did. All right. The answer is yes, we did in 2013 in July. Moving your money out of fossil fuels is so important. We must accelerate the transition to a low carbon economy. We must move our money out of ultra deep offshore oil, move our money out of the coal mining and coal power industries, move our money out of tar sands. Climate risk is financial risk. Let's move our money out of fossil fuels and force banks to recognize the threats to communities, the planet, and their shareholders, and reject all forms of finance for drilling in the Arctic and everywhere else. Today, you'll have the honor of hearing a dynamic and inspiring speakers discussing moving the money out of fossil fuels, climate change and fiduciary duty, and climate damages and deception, taking big oil out of oil to court. I know it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes a village to build community and the world to raise the planet. Let's mobilize, educate, and teach the intersections of capitalism, courts, and climate. Get ready to divest from fossil fuels to become truly fossil fuel-free California. Please enjoy today's Climate Finance Summit and all the other actions this week, including the Governor's Climate Action Summit. Thank you and have a blessed day.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned, Berkeley separated from Wells Fargo, or is in the process of doing that, and it really took its lead from Seattle. Seattle was the first to sort of make that charge, and our next presenter was really instrumental in the movement toward that. Alex Connon is organizer with 350 Seattle, and he helped organize Seattle's campaign to divest the city from Wells Fargo. He's also working on the campaign to get JP Morgan Chase to stop funding extreme fossil fuels. And he organized two major shutdown Chase Day actions of 2017 and 2018. I participated in the ones down here, they were really fun. In 2017, using a distributed organizing model, they simultaneously shut down 13 branches of JP Morgan Chase. And then in 2018, they shut down all of 2nd Avenue outside of JP Morgan Chase's Pacific Northwest headquarters to call for Chase to be held accountable for their investments in the Trans Mountain Pipeline. He is also on the City of Seattle's Public Bank Advisory Work Group. And when he's not campaigning against these banks, you have time to do other things. He spends his spare time writing his first novel, The Activist, was published in 2016. Please welcome Alex Connon.
Thank you. That was a really wonderful introduction. You'd think I almost wrote it myself. Thank you very much to David and everyone else who's organised this, to Sandy. It's a real pleasure to be here. The Climate Action Summit couldn't be coming at a more timely moment, which was really hammered home in our journey down here. We had a train booked, we wanted to come down on the train, and then we woke up in the morning. Our train was supposed to be at 9:30 in the morning, and we woke up that morning to an email saying, oh, we're sorry, your train has been cancelled because the train tracks are on fire. So we were like, oh God, how are we going to get down to the Bay Area? So we booked a bus, and the bus left at 1 o'clock that day, and we made our way into the bus station, and we arrived at the bus station, and they said, sorry, your bus has been cancelled, I-5 is on fire. And, you know, you talk about ironies. Climate activists can't get to the climate summit because the country is on fire. It doesn't get any kind of more clear cut than that. And one of the other ironies was that we ended up having to hire a car and drive down the coast, therefore contributing more carbon to the atmosphere than we would have had we taken the train. So we had become our very own little feedback loop. But it is an honour to be here, and I think one of the questions that we all need to be asking ourselves, and really one of the defining questions of our generation, is what can I do? What can I do in the face of this overpowering, overwhelming threat of global climate change as one single individual, one tiny, inconsequential human? What can I do in the face of this seemingly overpowering problem, such a complex problem? That question isn't made any less grand by the knowledge that how we answer that collectively will really define the future of our species and all life on Earth. And if that feels like quite a daunting way to kind of frame this talk and to start it, that's because it is. It is an extremely daunting problem that we're confronted with. But I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so discussing that one thing you can do. There are many things that you can do, from engaging with politicians, to going to city council hearings, to supporting things like the Climate Change Emergency Declaration, to pushing the governor, to being out in the streets, to sitting in front of pipelines, to pushing for a rapid transition to affordable public transit. There is, because it is such a huge problem, there are as many solutions as there are seconds in the day. But one thing that I hope to convince you of over the next now I suppose 17 minutes, is that one thing you can do is align your money with your values and make the Wall Street banks the focus of some of your community activism. As David mentioned, I've been working on campaigns against Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase for about 3 years now, and in that time I've become really convinced that it's strategic for the climate movement to focus some of their time, their energy and their resources on the Wall Street banks. And I want to make the case for that being a strategic use of our time and energy as climate activists in 3 different sections. First, I want to talk briefly about the role that Wall Street plays in the climate crisis. Then I'm going to move on and make the case for why it's strategic for us to target Wall Street with our activism. And then finally, I'm going to close with some thoughts on how we can do this effectively as individuals and members of organisations and activist communities. So firstly, the role that the banks play in the climate crisis was something I became first aware of during the Standing Rock resistance. In Seattle, we were really fortunate to have an incredibly strong and powerful Standing Rock solidarity movement that was led by a number of really inspiring Native American activists who are a vital part of the activist community up there. There were rallies that up to 1,000 people attended. There were city council resolutions expressing solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux passed in front of packed out council hearings. But there was still kind of this sense of like, what can we really do here in Seattle? Standing Rock Sioux's tribal land is in North Dakota, 1,000 miles away. What can we really do to influence that fight? But all of that really changed, I think, when the call from Standing Rock came to target the banks. That was kind of the starting signal, and we really hit the ground running in Seattle. In the month of December, we had 30 protests outside about a dozen Wells Fargo branches, culminating in a mass day of action in which about 40 Wells Fargo customers simultaneously closed their accounts one after another, and we had a rally of about 500 people. And from there we switched to really focusing on the city council and putting all of our time and our energy into trying to force, for lack of a better term, the city council to commit to breaking ties with Wells Fargo. And that happened on February 7th with 1,000 people showing up to a finance committee meeting to express their support. And that was quoted in the Seattle Times that the number was 1,000 people. And obviously they all couldn't fit inside, but there was a very large rally outside. And so through all of that campaigning, I've really come to learn that the banks aren't just complicit in the climate crisis, they're morally culpable in exactly the same way as the fossil fuel industry is morally culpable. They're not just profiting from the climate crisis, but they're actively enabling the climate crisis to grow worse. And what I mean by that is, and why I say that, is major fossil fuel corporations are entirely dependent on Wall Street and major banks to provide them loans so that they can build new pipelines, build new coal terminals, new oil terminals. In the last 3 years, the banks have lent $765 billion to fossil fuel companies, the majority of which goes towards building new projects at a time when we can't afford a single new fossil fuel project to be built. And this is because fossil fuel infrastructure is incredibly expensive. The Dakota Access Pipeline was $3.8 billion. The Keystone XL would cost TransCanada $8 billion. And that means that the banks just simply don't have enough liquid capital to build these projects without major loans. Without major bank loans, they just can't afford to build these projects. And what that means is that if we can stop the banks from giving these fossil fuel companies money, we can stop the growth of the fossil fuel industry. To put that in as succinct a way as possible, if we stop the flow of dollars, we stop the flow of oil. If we stop the flow of dollars, we are keeping the oil in the ground because they can't build the projects they need to get it out of the ground. And now to move on to why I think it makes strategic sense for the climate movement to target the banks. That is the number one reason. It stops projects. Our activism on the banks can effectively keep oil and coal and gas where it belongs, where it needs to stay, in the grounds. But there's another major reason why I think it's really strategic for the climate movement to target the banks, and that's movement building. Everybody hates the banks. Like, from bankrupting the economy to forcing 10 million people out of their homes to funding private prisons to discriminatory lending practices that target immigrants and people of colour. There is no reason to like Wall Street, and people are primed to join in on a campaign that is about holding the banks accountable to their corporate greed and their immoral corporate practices. This makes them prime for engaging people in campaigns. The other reason that they have such huge movement building potential is every town in America has a corporate Wall Street bank. Not every town has a fight against a pipeline. Not every town has a fight against a coal terminal or an oil terminal that people can rally around. Every town has a bank. And these two things, people's readiness to dislike the banks, their entirely justified readiness to not like and hate the banks, and the fact that there are banks everywhere, really make the banks the perfect symbol of the evil of climate change that people can rally around. And we need a mass movement. I think the climate movement has to be in its infancy. I think there are probably hundreds of thousands in the country who identify as being in the climate movement. We need millions. And so we really need to, in all of our work, we need to be thinking about growing the number of people who identify as climate activists and who identify as being part of the climate movement, and I think the banks provide a good opportunity to do that. Just briefly, a couple of other reasons why I believe it's strategic for us to target the banks. By targeting the banks, we can help shift societal norms, we can help shift cultural norms. One of the central goals of the divestment movement wasn't to bankrupt the industry, but it was to remove the social license of the fossil fuel industry. And by targeting the banks with divestment campaigns, we can continue that vitally important work. And it seems to me to be a natural evolution of the divestment movement to target the banks. With divestment, traditional divestment, we were saying it is immoral to profit from the fossil fuel industry. Now we are saying the fossil fuel industry is so immoral that it is immoral to do business with, to profit from businesses that profit from the fossil fuel industry. And so by stigmatizing the banks because of their role in the fossil fuel industry, we are continuing the stigmatization of the fossil fuel industry itself, which I believe we can see the success of the divestment movement in the spate of lawsuits by city and county governments around this country. When the divestment movement started 7 or 8 years ago, the goal was to paint the fossil fuel industry as an immoral, illegitimate force in our society. And we've achieved that to such an extent that major cities are now suing them because of their immoral, illegitimate actions in our society. A final reason why I think it really is strategic for us to run campaigns focusing on the banks is that they're winnable. The central business model of the fossil fuel industry is extracting and burning fossil fuels. They are not going to change their central business model. The central business model of the banks is not extracting and burning fossil fuels. On average, only between 1% and 4% of Wall Street banks have their total holdings or assets in fossil fuels. It's a relatively small percentage of their business. What that means is that there must come a point when their investments in fossil fuels become so reputationally and financially risky to the banks that it's simply no longer worth it for them, for their bottom line, for their balance sheets, to continue investing in these projects. And we got a hint that that is possible with Defund Apple. There was a recent study from the Cass Business School in London analysing depositor activism during the height of the Defund Apple movement, found that the 17 banks who were funding DAPL lost out on between $8 to $20 billion worth of business as a result of their Dakota Access Pipeline investments. That's the language the banks talk. If we can replicate that and prove that was not a one-off, the banks will just start looking at their balance sheets and think these investments don't make any sense for us. Or if they don't go that far, they will at least increase the interest rates on the loans that they give to fossil fuel companies, which, as unsexy as this sounds, anything we can do to increase the costs of fossil fuel projects, make them less economically viable. Some fossil fuel projects already have a wafer-thin profit margin, particularly capital-intensive fossil fuel projects like the tar sands and Arctic drilling that require an average oil price of over $90 a barrel to make a profit. Anything we can do to make the building of new projects more expensive makes them less likely to go ahead. And targeting the banks is definitely one way for us to do that. And one other thing on winnable campaigns, we're not just targeting the banks. I would love to see the divestment movement evolve and how we have this wonderful list of institutions like the World Council of Churches and Stanford University and the City of Berkeley and the nation of Ireland that have committed to divesting from fossil fuels. I would love to see a wonderful list of foundations and churches and morally responsible institutions who say we're not banking with these banks because these banks are as immoral as the fossil fuel industry. And this work has already begun. There's an organisation called Mazaska Talks. Mazaska is the Lakota word for money. That's Mazaska, Mazaska Talks. It was founded by some dear friends of mine, Native American activists who we partnered with in the Wells Fargo campaign in Seattle. And they're calling for a boycott of the banks that are funding new tar sands projects in particular. And already organisations representing over 10 million supporters have joined that boycott. What I would love to see is the climate movement moving into a space where we are seeing moral institutions such as universities and foundations add their name to that boycott. And that gives us the opportunity to run thousands of potentially winnable campaigns. We can run campaigns at the University of Berkeley calling on the University of Berkeley to join the bank boycott. We can partner with city council members and run campaigns at the City of Berkeley to get them to add their name to the boycott. And in that way, this can gain major traction and continue that process of shifting cultural and societal norms, stigmatizing not only the fossil fuel industry, but other industries that profit from and enable the growth of the fossil fuel industry. So, to summarize, the 4 reasons I think it makes strategic sense for us to target the banks with our activism. Doing so can stop projects, doing so provides huge movement building opportunities, doing so can shift cultural and societal norms, and doing so can provide us with the opportunity to run hundreds of winnable campaigns. I'm going to shift to spend my last 4 or 5 minutes talking about what that looks like. How do we get involved in community activism that's targeting the financial sector? The first and most obvious way to do so is to align your money with your values. There's an old saying that every dollar you spend is essentially a vote for the sort of world that you want to live in. And as long as you are banking with Wall Street banks like Chase and Wells Fargo, you're essentially casting votes for a world in which banks are allowed and able to fund new fossil fuel projects. So moving your money out of those banks into credit unions, not-for-profit banks, banks that aren't profiting from the destruction of our planet and the harming of our people. But that's only one thing. That's kind of the equivalent of changing your light bulbs and driving a Prius, which is important and great, but it's certainly not enough when we have a climate emergency and we're quickly running out of time and the problems are systemic, not the behaviour of specific individuals. So while you absolutely should move your money, and when you're moving your money, you should absolutely inform the bank of why you're doing it. And you should tell them again and again and again and again why you're doing it. You should book a meeting with the bank manager and tell them why you're doing it. You should call the customer service line and ask to speak to a supervisor and tell them why you're doing it. You should write Jamie Dimon if you're a Chase customer and tell him why you're closing your account. It's no good us moving our money and not informing them why. They need to know why they're losing our custom and why they're losing our service and losing our money. But as important as that is, we also need to be making the banks the focus of our sustained and meaningful community activism. And I think there are at least a couple of ways in which to do that. There's been a an ongoing campaign against JP Morgan Chase now for a couple of years. JP Morgan Chase is the largest funder of extreme fossil fuels on Wall Street. Not only that, they're getting worse. In 2017, they increased their financing of tar sands by 400%. And they increased their financing of the world's largest 30 coal companies by 2,100%. And this is at a time when other Wall Street banks are kind of ramping, incrementally moving in the right direction. Chase is doubling down. And in response to this, organisations like Rainforest Action Network, Honour the Earth, Sierra Club, Greenpeace USA, as well as 350.org affiliated groups like 350 Seattle and 350 Madison, are now coordinating on a campaign against Chase to call on Chase to stop financing those extreme fossil fuels. As was alluded to, that looks in many ways from organising customers to close their accounts, to closing your own accounts, to participating in national days of action, to participating in call-in days and email days. And I'm going to invite anyone who is interested in participating or getting involved in a campaign against Chase in this area to please send me an email afterwards. I am an organiser, so this is my little organising pitch. My email is alec, A-L-E-C, @350seattle.org. And this is really it has to be a national campaign by its nature. If we're going to affect this huge national corporation, there needs to be community groups all over the country nationally working on this. So if there was a group of people from Fossil Free California or other Berkeley community activist groups who wanted to get involved in that campaign, please reach out to me and I'm happy to get on the phone and talk more. And so to wrap up here, the climate crisis is the most complex of fights. The fossil fuel industry's chokehold on our society touches and impacts every single aspect of our society. And as such, we need to be fighting on every single front for rapid change away from a fossil fuel-based economy. But I hope I've helped to convince some of you that one of those fronts has to be the financial sector, because, to summarise it one more time, if we stop the flow of dollars, we stop the flow of oil.
Thank you, Alec, and thank you for your organizing work in Seattle. It's very inspiring, and your actions for Dump Chase were replicated in cities all over, including in Berkeley. I think from 3 places in Berkeley, 1 place in San Francisco. So it's just how we roll, one action to the next. Are there questions for Alec or for Cheryl? Okay, gather the cards.
Maybe what I'll do is I'll ask a question while we're waiting to get the other questions down. And that is that there was a really interesting article in the New York Times, I think about a week ago, that talked about sort of the fracking bubble, that actually it's not a good investment. I mean, basically we're told that these investments are immoral, but they're also not good investments. The fracking industry is not a good return, and yet these banking institutions continue to invest in them. And I guess my question is, what can we do to say to them, you're not even good at being greedy, what is your problem? And try to hit them from that front as well. Like say there are some people who actively work in staying involved with the bank in order to try to go to board meetings and that kind of thing, to protest from the inside as well as push from the outside. And if you have any comments about that approach, but also just why the bad investments?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I don't know. I'm guessing there's a lot of gamblers out there, and there's a lot of people who know that the end of the fossil fuel industry is coming, and then they think they can ride the wave and hold on to those investments and get out at just the right time. But we already know that 80% of the fossil fuel reserves that are already factored onto the share market values of fossil fuel corporations cannot be burned if we want to live in a world with a livable climate. And that means the end of the fossil fuel industry is coming. The only question is whether or not it's going to come quickly enough. And unfortunately, I think some people are so myopic that they're gambling that there's still money to be made out of the fossil fuel industry. But I think everyone in this room is working very hard to make sure that they're betting the wrong way.
This is actually, we have, I think, about 5 minutes left for Q&A, so we don't have a ton of time left for Q&A of this person, but we do have a question for Cheryl about the website for the ad hoc, is it the ad hoc link?
The ad hoc subcommittee?
Yes.
Sure, so you could go to thecityofberkeley.info and click on City Council, and then there'll be a list of all the ad hoc subcommittees, and there's one that says Ad hoc Subcommittee for Climate Emergency Declaration. And then you'll get to the page.
And then you mentioned an event happening in 2019, is that correct?
Yeah, so if you want to get to that event, you can send an email to my office. I can leave some cards, but my email is cdavila@cityofberkeley.info, or you can send it to my assistant, who is Sarah Kirshnar, KERSHNAR @cityofberkeley.info, to get and give us your email and state that you're interested in coming to the summit, and we'll add you to our list and invite you.
Thank you. Some of these questions are going to be really applicable to the more time of Q&A following the other speakers who are going to be talking. So if I don't get to your question, I think there will be plenty of opportunities to address them later on as well, specifically around banks and credit unions and that kind of thing, because we will be talking about that to some extent. So I'm moving to, I'm going to say Montana, Minnesota in October, where I'll fight another pipeline. How can I find a non-Wall Street bank? Is there a list?
I believe there's numerous lists out there. One great avenue is just go for a credit unions. Credit unions need to be non-profit banks. They don't do the kind of speculative investing that Wall Street banks do. So, if you just want to take a pretty simple approach, any credit union is going to be better than Wells Fargo or JP Morgan. There are lists. There's an organization called Green America has a list. 350 Seattle also has a list on its website. And I know Fossil Free California has done some Move Your Money work and perhaps provides lists of better banks. And I think one of our next speakers is also going to be talking about the kind of practicalities of moving your money and finding a better bank. But yeah, generally look for a credit union or look for a not-for-profit bank. There's Beneficial State Bank is a not-for-profit bank that operates in Washington. I don't know if it's in California.
Yes,
but
it is.
It
It's
is.
here in Oakland.
Yeah, so Beneficial State Bank would be another better option. Again, it's a not-for-profit bank.
And we, out on the table, the Fossil Free California table out there, locally, obviously not for Minnesota, but locally here in the East Bay, we have a list of credit unions available and socially responsible banks. So I urge you, feel free to go pick up one of those. If by any chance they're all gone, we do have a website where all that information is available as well. So.
I think Code Pink also has a tool to let you decide or see how your money is being invested as well.
And I think we'll be
That's
talking
great
about
lead
that.
into the next session.
Yeah, exactly. The next question is kind of an interesting one, and I think speaks to your talking about how it's so pervasive. We really have to fight the fight on all fronts, and because it's involved in all of our lives. Do you work with the animal rights activists to combine forces? Would you consider doing so? And you mentioned a small thing to do is to vote with our dollars. Do you think going vegan could also be a small thing they can do?
I think the evidence is really clear now that plant-based diet is much less carbon intensive than a meat-based diet. And I know for a lot of people, the idea of going vegan would be a big step, but even just taking incremental steps to reduce the amount of carbon intensive food that you eat in your diet would be steps in the right direction. And vegan diets are generally definitely amongst the least carbon intensive of diets. In regards to we partner with animal rights activists and movements, yeah, I mean, I think the more kind of cross-movement, intersectional work that we can do, whether it's with immigrant rights activists or racial justice activists or animal rights activists, the better. 350 Seattle hasn't had the opportunity to partner with animal rights activists, but we have been fortunate to be able to partner with some amazing racial justice organizations and immigrant rights organizations, and it's always been fruitful and wonderful to be able to kind of recognize the intersections of our work.
And I just want to add, Indivisible Berkeley has really, it's a relatively new organization, and they understand the power of partnerships. So if you are with an animal rights group and want to reach out to 350 and work to Indivisible Berkeley about ways that we can collaborate and partner, I think this is right for all of that kind of work. So, and how are we doing for time? 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay. Let's see. This one was an interesting one, just because I haven't heard discussions about this, but insurance for mining and pipelines, workers' comp is supposed to pay for injuries of deaths of workers in dangerous industries, but they don't do it. If they were held accountable, rates would rise. So I guess that's an interesting point, that maybe insurance companies, which is often very much linked to financial institutions, what role can we play, I guess, in pressuring other players as well?
It's a good question. I'm not sure if I know the answer, but yeah, I know that, we just have to be mindful and careful of all the aspects what we put our money into and see where that money's going, because it's important. And now that's making me think about my insurance, and now I'm gonna go back and look and see like how that's actually playing out in real life, because that's not something that I actually thought about. Right? I mean, I bank at a credit union and have been for many, many, many years, and my retirement is not invested in any. I try to only do mutual funds and things that I know that are politically correct and not putting money into the wrong. So, but no, I never thought about my car insurance or my other, insurance. So that's a good point. I don't know what you have to say.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, I think the insurance companies are terrified of climate change.
Yeah.
A wildfire comes along and destroys a community. Who pays for it? Insurance companies. So the insurance companies are ready. They understand the threat of climate change because it directly threatens their bottom line. And they're, without insurance, a lot of major fossil fuel projects can't go ahead. And so there's a lot of growing community activism to call on insurance companies to stop insuring, the fossil fuel industry. I know Rainforest Action Network are just about to hire an organizer to work on that full time. It's not an area I've worked on or have particular expertise in, but I know it is one front of the fight for sure.
There is an event tonight of insurance with the Sunrise Project, who's being engaged with insurance companies to withdraw insurance from fossil fuel projects.
I didn't hear all that. Can we repeat it on microphone?
Yes.
Oh no, there is an event tonight on insurance and strategy around insurance companies to not insure fossil fuel projects anymore in the American Bookbinders Museum at 6.
Oh, great, thank you.
When you say sunrise, what?
Sunrise
Project.
Australia.
Thank you for that. That's wonderful. So other good questions that we can try to get to, but also I hope that people will stick around afterwards. A lot of us will be happy to answer any other questions that we can. Someone asked about, are there actions happening in Oakland? If you make them happen, let's partner and let's do it. Absolutely. So there are, and we can talk a little bit about that. So, but we are going to move on to the next phase. So as I mentioned, Indivisible Berkeley's Economic Justice team was really fortunate In fact, we were sort of struggling because we were a relatively small team and figuring out how do we have sort of the capacity to do all the actions that we want to do. And we were really fortunate to engage with our two next speakers, and they really helped revitalize us. One is Sandy Emerson, who really put this on, and David Ellison as well. So. Sandy Emerson is a retired software executive and heads the Move Your Money campaign for fossil-free California. Inspired by divestment pledges made for the 2014 People's Climate March, Sandy has been giving presentations on why and how to divest a personal portfolio from fossil fuels, and how to move your money out of polluting banks and credit cards, and how to begin exploring investments in clean energy technologies. As a personal divestment evangelist, Sandy believes in the power of individuals to move markets away from fossil fuels and other unhealthy investments in order to make way for a world of clean energy in a peace economy. David Elston is a software developer and a divestment leader for 350 Silicon Valley. Like many, he was called to climate action by the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. He started campaigning against fossil fuel banking and giving Move Your Money workshops, often with Sandy, around the Bay. In fact, there's one going on tonight, correct, at Santa Clara University, in case any of you are heading back to the peninsula. But throughout all this, David has a dark secret. He was part owner of every public oil company in the world. Every drop of oil padded his 401k. As he struggled to divest, David vowed to make it easier for others. David will introduce sustainable investing and show you how you can take control of the impact of your investments. He'll demo the tool he's been developing, which uses impact data from nonprofits and others to help you build a clean portfolio. Please welcome Sandy David.
When I became involved with divestment, I had a portfolio which was sort of an accident of capitalism. I joined a startup that started up and continued, and I ended up with a portfolio of various things. And I took a look at some of those. I was horrified to find that I was invested in Keystone XL, I was invested in this, that, and the other thing. But during the process of working through those investments, I never changed my banks. I never thought about my banking. With the indigenous-led activism around Dakota Access Pipeline, it became clear that anyone with a banking relationship can make a difference by moving their money out of polluting banks. We all know that investments in fossil fuel companies will become worthless. But why wait for that to happen? You can move your money now and help render the transition that much faster. The fossil fuel companies depend on the valuation of their reserves to make themselves look like a going concern. And they depend on capital expenditures for exploring for new sources of oil, extreme fuels, and dirty fuels everywhere to make themselves look like a going concern. Exxon, for a brief period in 2016 or something, moved out of funding new capital projects, and the share prices dropped because the belief system of the market is that you have to continue to grow and grow and grow and drill and expand and relentlessly pursue new sources of reserves. As you know, 80% of these reserves have to stay in the ground if we are to avoid catastrophic climate warming. The actions started by the Defund DAPL movement amplified bank activism that really began with the crash of 2008, when it became clear what bad actors banks are and how little they care about the welfare of their customers. During the Occupy movement in 2011, there were also bank exits. But the Dakota Access Pipeline movement and the data that accompanied it, the wonderful volunteer-led research that exposed how the banks and how the project managers of those banks are connected to the pipeline projects. That's what really started this landslide of bank exits. The total, as Alex pointed out, is some $15 billion so far and counting. There are so many reasons to break up with megabanks. They invest in pipelines and prisons and nukes, and not to mention fossil fuels, all the name brands. 25 megabanks invested $785 billion in damaging fossil fuels from 2013 to 2015. The Rainforest Action Network is one of these great data centers that pulls all this stuff together. They do a report every year on bank investments and how carbon project financing is going. There was a sort of dip in bank financing for fossil fuel projects in the run-up to the Paris Climate Accord. But once we got past that, and of course once Trump pulled out, the financing resumed, even for coal. Who would invest in coal? But the banks are forming this part of a belief system that is purely fictitious. It doesn't have any strength except the perceptions of people who continue to invest. So, Food and Water Watch and Rainforest Action Network did connect the dots. I understand, David Elliston, that you asked Bank of America during that time when you became activated by Dakota Access Pipeline. You said, so are you funding the Dakota Access Pipeline? And I understand that they said, no, we're not funding the pipeline. Well, they're funding the project company that funds the pipeline. There's a wonderful data guy, I think he's in Seattle, who makes all of these connections clear little by little. It's a very tangled web, how all these companies are structured and their ownership, and it all sort of feeds into the project itself. Energy Transfer Partners, you may have heard that name. It's the project manager company, and it is currently suing Greenpeace, among others, for interfering with its business. We'll see how that goes. So, do bank actions count? Yes, they do. The CEOs of banks and the CEOs of project management firms pay attention, and they even get annoyed enough to file baseless lawsuits. In all, 35 banks funded directly or indirectly the Dakota Access Pipeline. All the name brands, you can see their logos here. When you're thinking about where you put your money, you are thinking about, is your money aligned with your values? You know that money talks, so what is your money saying about you? And it is your money. About 45% of the 17.3 trillion in deposits are controlled by the 4 largest banks. So start at the top, divest from them. In all, individual households own about 80% of the $30 trillion equity market, 38% directly. And it's your money. And it's our money. 11 trillion of these assets are controlled by women. The first thing you want to know when you're changing your banking relationship is, so where do I move my money? Credit unions, as has been pointed out, are a good bet. There are socially responsible banks. There are community financial development institutions, which are a specialized type of bank that invest in low-income communities and community projects. Look for a bank like Beneficial State Bank, that's a B Corp, which is, required and has signed up and is certified to reinvest in the community. Your local banks may have local investments, mainly centering around vehicles and real estate rather than pipelines and prisons. The mega banks, some of them invest a lot in community projects. It's part of, polishing their image. And look what Wells Fargo is trying to do with its reinvention campaign. Their share price got really hammered by all the scandals, and it's sort of plateauing. But the mega banks are operating globally, and they may assert that they are removing funding from pipeline projects or extreme fuel projects, but it bears watching. There's a wonderful website called bankstalking.org that reads the, security filings and gets way down into the details. And usually if a bank says, like US Bank, no, we're not going to do any more such and such projects, it turns out that another arm of US Bank will have extended a line of credit for these same projects. So get away from the mega banks. There are lots of other options. Credit unions are pervasive. They are extremely accepting. They have more free ATMs than big banks. And there are good research tools like banklocal.info where you can type in your town name or your zip code. You will get a list of banks within a geographical radius, and then you can get a report card on an individual bank. The site NerdWallet has a good list of banks, and Green America has a deep list of resources, including lists of socially responsible banks. The recipe for moving your checking and savings account was put out by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau years ago. It's repeated and repeated, this list of steps. But obviously, you open a new account before you close your other account. You make sure that all your direct deposit and automatic payments have been moved over. But the most important step when you close your big bank account is to write a letter to the CEO of that bank and say why you're closing your account, and put a copy on file with your local bank as well. The CEO may very well send you a direct communication. It happens, I've heard it. But the most important part is how you feel once you have summoned your resolve and you have moved your money and stated so in writing. During bank actions, it's often possible to take this action with others, to do your closing of your account as part of a bank action. That's particularly effective. And don't forget about your credit cards. You need to open clean credit cards because the processors, Visa, Discover, MasterCard, whatever, are affiliated quite often with the mega banks. Speaking personally, I had a serious addiction to my Chase Mileage Plus Explorer, but I changed it. There are responsible credit cards. If you bank with a different bank, they may offer a credit card, and so there you are. There are a lot of affinity cards available from TCM Bank, which is a mild-mannered, a clean investing bank that sponsors cards for Amazon Watch, for Green America, and others. And interestingly, one of my main affinities, REI, offers a credit card from US Bank, so that's no good. When you're moving your money, you think, okay, so I've moved my so many dollars. Does this have an effect? But some researchers charted a decline in new deposits after no DAPL activism. And the top darker areas changed to lighter areas when new deposits declined. As Alex said, they lost billions of dollars. There have been many cities that take bank divestment resolutions, Seattle and San Francisco among them. It's effective, of course, when cities take resolutions, because that's big bucks, but each individual resolution is important too. The other side of the equation, which I will introduce before David shows you how to see what's in your portfolio, is fossil fuel divestment. I became energized by the 2014 People's Climate March when the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested from fossil fuels. I thought if the heirs to an oil fortune would divest from fossil fuels, then what was I waiting for? And I wanted to teach other people how to divest their portfolios, and the most important thing is being able to find out what's in there. For years, I was a passive investor. I had no idea. The first step in this process is to set your intention. There's a group called divestinvest.org that takes individual pledges. You pledge not to invest in the Carbon Underground 200. You pledge to sell your current investments and reinvest in the new energy economy. It's really important to set your intention. The divestinvest.org, like Mazaska Talks, is accumulating these pledges, and as of this date, Divest has identified worldwide from individuals and institutions a total of $6.3 trillion assets under management that have been pledged to divest. It all adds up. It's adding up in a spectacular way. The divestment movement is one of the fastest growing social movements of this century. You should also think about your 401k, and you should educate your advisor. That's often a very important step. Cities have done fossil fuel divestments. We had a lovely pledge from New York City in December saying that they would divest their 5 common retirement funds to the tune of $5.2 billion. The World Bank has signed on. The Norway Sovereign Wealth Fund has signed on. This is when their sovereign wealth comes from oil. The Statoil company, in fact, in Norway, is rebranding itself to get oil out of its name. The entire country of Ireland has pledged to divest from fossil fuels, and Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon has just introduced a bill that would divest one part of the civil service fund, so divest the feds. Lots of cities have divested. Yesterday, divestinvest.org announced a Divest Cities campaign, so these municipal resolutions are going to keep coming in and keep adding up. There is statistical evidence as well that divestment announcements depress share prices. The red dips below are where share prices fell below what would have been expected following divestment announcements. Not only that, but the world of socially responsible investing is growing fast. You no longer have to assume that if you're going to be socially responsible that you may lose money. Socially responsible investing has grown 33% in the last few years, represents $8.72 trillion of assets under management out of $40 trillion total, and the performance regularly exceeds the performance of traditional funds. As You Sow just published a report. It's interesting because As You Sow has focused on engagement with fossil fuel companies, but this could be changing. They reported some data from Corporate Knights that New York would have been $15 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels in the last 10 years. And the state of Massachusetts would have been $3 billion richer if it had divested from fossil fuels. So it pays to divest. I encourage you to move your money, and divestment works. Thank you.
Repeat the silent transfer to my solemnly stand here. Oh, is it? It's probably already working up there. Good enough? Yes.
But you just need to expand it to the whole screen.
Yeah, I'm just having trouble thinking how to do that. I don't really see.
Yellow button up on the top.
I don't really see anything.
Green
I don't know, top bar.
Yeah, I mean, I can do that. So.
There you
Oh,
go.
yay.
All right, so.
Thank you.
Yes. Alrighty. Hi, my name is David Elliston. You can find me at cleanmoney.us, which is my project and where I put resources out for like where you can find banks and such. I'll be talking about finance, so I should mention, and we need some kind of disclaimer that I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not a financial professional, and that I can't give like paid advice to people, basically. My idea with cleanmoney.us is to give peer-to-peer advice to help each other and support each other through the transition out of this. But with regard to investing, past performance is not indicative of future results. All investing involves risk, and this data is believed to be accurate. So how did we get here? I haven't been to many protests myself until the last couple of years. I'm an engineer. I used to sit behind a desk, but we got to this moment, right? You know, after the Dakota Access Pipeline protests, and I realized that my Bank of America checking account was sitting there helping Bank of America fund all these things. I felt a new emotion, something we started to learn about in 2017. I felt complicit. It was kind of an emotional shock for me, and I think that Thanksgiving in 2016 was a low point, the lowest point, a total emotional wreck for me as an American citizen to watch and learn about the protests and the violent actions that were taking place in the Dakota Access, on the Dakota Access Pipeline event under Barack Obama's president, right? So things did not look good, and I think we were all looking for some lever. What power do I have since that system's not working for me? And I, after cleaning up my Bank of America account, I realized what power money has. And it felt very satisfying to move over to a credit union, to go into the office and give Bank of America a piece of my mind. It was kind of short-lived though, because when I went out and started presenting with Sandy and others, I learned what you guys know now, that there is carbon in our retirement accounts. There is toxic assets in our nest egg. And in fact, I personally realized that yes, I own hundreds of oil companies. Pretty much every public toxic company you can imagine, I own. And perhaps many of you do. Does anybody here have like a mutual fund or in their 401k or maybe an IRA, something like that? So, and some of you may have pensions, which we didn't talk about much, where you don't have much control over this, of what they invest in. But many of us have these retirement accounts, and so I faced mine. And it was bad news. I went to the Fossil Free Fund site from As You Sow, which we'll be hearing about, seeing about, and I looked up my typical mutual fund. This is the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. So, by the way, this is in like so many 401ks out there you can't imagine. In fact, the default that people are directed to is to have their money in this fund and a couple others. It's considered an appropriate thing to put it in, right? And what it has, Fossil Free Funds has this fantastic tool for breaking down what is in the mutual fund And so obviously this mutual fund total stock market index contains kind of every US public company you could reasonably invest in. So there's thousands of them. And this includes producers of carbon, like the Carbon Underground, the largest holders of carbon who actually are priced on their carbon. Includes very little coal industry, they're kind of dead, but oil industry is big there, and then all the consumers. So you can kind of add it up, and there are different ways of measuring this, and different numbers you can jump onto. But here, I think a useful number is at 10%. This is 10% of the companies in the stock market have, oil and gas as their main businesses, or significant polluters because of their consumption of it. And with the S&P 500, which I hope everyone has heard of, it's a little worse, 11%. But it's kind of consistent. In fact, most mutual funds are going to have a lot of fossil fuels in them. And so I wanted to get rid of that. I wanted to get rid of fossil fuels from my portfolio. And what I took for a target was to reduce my carbon footprint. And when I show you live this site of fossil-free funds later, and we click through it, you'll see that you can look at the average carbon weight of all the companies in your portfolio. And you can start to look for sets of companies that have been optimized for not having so much carbon. So, in fact, there are simple things you can do right now. You can buy the S&P 500 without the main fossil fuel producers. This is a ticker. It's a fairly easy thing to sell your S&P 500 fund and buy an S&P 500 without mutual fund, without fossil fuels fund, SPYX, if you're looking. So this is like a simple step you can take. Now it still has 6% fossil fuel. It's not like super clean because of the consumer side, but the products are out there. There are simple things that we can do to move our money. And there are funds out there that are actually really clean, right? If you go to fossil-free funds, you can research and find the funds that have no carbon in them. Not no carbon, but no oil companies, no fossil-free, no fossil producers, no fossil consumers. And so I spent a lot of time on fossil-free funds last year looking at the profile of different funds. But I was also a pretty serious do-it-yourself investor. I had a lot of asset classes and a very complicated portfolio. And it's not actually that easy. If you look inside a fund like Parnassus Endeavor, it's great that it has 88% less carbon footprint than your typical fund. But it also is not exactly like your typical fund. It is well known, it's very famous, it's been doing great. It also has like 20% of its holdings in Qualcomm and Gilead. Very not big companies, right? So this is not a total stock market index anymore. You're making very serious bets on something. It's not, the kind of diversified fund. So to sort of, if you start looking for diversified funds, and you can do this, you can go to fossil-free funds, you can find my presentation later and find out all the things to punch in, but you look for a large stock fund that's fully diversified, and you'll find like 9, right, out of 10,000 funds. There are 9 large cap funds that are diversified, and some of them we talked about, like Parnassus. This is labeled as diversified, and a handful of funds. So it's not quite ready for us just to jump over onto these things. It is a little more complicated than it looks. So I did spend last year learning a bit about sustainable investing, explaining what I learned and how I learned to bring portfolios together, and then the tools that maybe you can start to take a look at to see what's inside of yours and start to get comfortable with the new options out there. So, how much time do I have?
13
minutes. Wow, I must be talking quickly. Terminology. So socially responsible investing is what this was called in the 80s. This is when grandma went in there, she didn't want tobacco or whatever. It has evolved over time, but fortunately the acronym has stayed the same. It is still SRI. It is now called Sustainable, Responsible, and Impact Investing. And here is the industry definition. This type of investing is a discipline that considers environmental, social, and governance criteria in addition to financial criteria when deciding what to invest in. And so, as Sandy pointed out, looking at the US, $8 trillion, looking globally, this was 2 years ago, $23 trillion. This stuff has been happening, but it hasn't been happening for us. I mean, us, unless you are a wealthy person, it hasn't been really accessible to you until more recent years. But the wealthy people have been doing this and doing fine. Now it's coming to us, and we need to figure out a way to make that come very quickly. So just to give you the quick sense of what is impact investing, there are different types, and this is not my slide, this is from Morgan Stanley, so they're very respectable. The first type is called restriction screening. Like, I don't want fossil fuels in my portfolio. I want the S&P 500 without fossil fuels. So that was that kind of ticker where you have that kind of fund is a restrictive fund, and you can get rid of tobacco, and you can start to filter out many things. And this is like this was version 1 of socially responsible that happened, back in the earlier days. I don't want to own that. That much I know. I don't know what I want to own, but I don't want that. And what that evolved into in the last, say, 15 years is this ESG, environmental social governance. People start to use words like sustainability. But what it means is that companies, when you're deciding as a mutual fund manager, I say I'm going to manage a fund and it's going to look like an index fund, but it's going to be better somehow. It's going to be more tolerable, you're going to like the components in there. And the way they do that is they measure every single company in there on criteria of how good or bad they are, and they try to find the mutual funds or they try to compose their mutual fund from the best actors out there. The other two dimensions we'll see less of. Thematic exposure means I want to own solar. I want to own this particular thing. And yeah, we can all do that. It's very common to own 5 or 10% energy, but if you put 50% of your money into solar, you're in for a really rocky ride. So thematic exposure is something we bring in for diversification and also because we have conviction. I want to invest in clean energy. I'm not going to lose my shirt, but I don't quite know what it's going to do. I'll put in my small amount of that. And then impact investing is not going to be available to you in the public markets. If you look at that end of the scale, they start to talk about things that don't provide competitive returns. And it is basically very difficult, if not impossible, to find something for sale in mutual funds that aren't intended to provide competitive returns. But as we evolve together, I would like to help others find ways to invest in those things that maybe have a charitable component. And that may be more in the private area. I want that technology to succeed enough that I'm going to be, charitably involved in that. Or I want community-based bonds, and I'm willing to put 5% of my bonds into community development bonds at lower interest rates to my community members. But here we're pretty much talking about taking your portfolio, managing the risk, and trying to get the same return you've been hoping for in the past without having to own toxic things. And just in terms of what ESG means, this is kind of a bunch of criteria, but from an environmental side, you might measure the cleanliness of things, technology, pollution, water use. From a social perspective, labor relations, and from a governance side, board diversity. We'll actually look at another way of looking at this. This is 17 of them. Okay, and then how does it perform? Well, there are nice long-term track records here. So looking at the all-country world index, every stock that people can kind of buy, they have a ex-fossil fuel version of that, like the S&P 500 one that I showed you. And it's been doing just fine. Yeah, of course it's doing a little better because fossil fuel is kind of on its grim decline. But it generally performs like the overall market. Now, if you look at the social index KLD, which has been around for like 25 years, this isn't about fossil fuel anymore. This is about some kind of social metrics, and they're looking at these companies and judging them, and it also has basically kind of performed like the market, maybe a little better. But generally, these funds are trying to behave like you would expect, but give you exposure to the people who you want to be with. So, I'm going to jump into a demo now, because what I found, you have this fossil-free fund site, and you can go there, you go into your account, you see like your biggest holding, and then type in that ticker into fossil-free funds, and you get the bad news. Okay, but how do we clean it up? I spent hundreds of hours last year doing this for myself, because I'm a little fussy about asset allocations, but this is what normally people own. This is what you will typically find yourself ushered into in any 401k is a target date fund or a fund that has multiple pieces to it, And it may even evolve over time with you. If you say, I want to retire in 2040, it'll slowly move the bond number up. The point is that your return is essentially 90% dictated by the asset classes you choose. We're supposed to have these 4 types of asset classes. So if you're going to compose your alternative, cleaner portfolio, you just need to be finding these pieces of it. And that's why I built this tool. So this tool, I'll give you a demo now. How much time do you have?
7.
Let's see, so how do I, cool. All right, well, we'll do it like this. All right. So, we'll be able to log in. So this tool has been my dream to build since I was manually working with fossil-free funds for many, many hours. The idea is to bring that impact data into the portfolio planning process. And one dimension to this is simply to rate 401ks that are out there. So for instance, we come in here and we've put in some of the funds for various 401ks like Google. We might want to know, well, what's in the Google 401k? The Google company has presented these funds to its employees, said these are the funds available to you. Let's see how we're doing. And what we'll get into a eye chart level table, but first in the process of building a portfolio in your 401k, you would choose your investment time horizon in order to give yourself an asset allocation. And so this is something you might want to figure out on your own. There are tools out there, but 20% bonds would be an appropriate allocation for somebody my age and for quite a range of people. Next, we want to try to help you customize what your impact priorities are. So we have data, measurements of companies in various dimensions, and then the question is what is valuable or most important to you? When we measure something like Earth, we're looking at the efficiency of a company in terms of its water usage or power usage, its adoption of renewable energy and such. And so the ratings that we present here are based on that kind of thing. If we present wealth, it has more to do with equal access to pay, employees not being brutally overpaid, just looking at the economic side of things. And on the equality side, looking more about board diversity. There are great data on the performance of non-diverse boards. They are not doing particularly well. The 17% of boards out there with no women on them are underperforming. And so you might simply, and in fact, this data is not mine. This data is coming from a company called Hip Investor that's been doing ratings for the last decade and is here in San Francisco. So they're supplying this data and I'm explaining a bit about how they look at ratings. But their philosophy is not entirely about the impact, but also the benefit of, the financial benefit of sustainable companies. That a company that is operationally efficient tends to have better returns. A company with a diverse board tends to have better returns. So that's where they're coming from. But this is simply a ratings mechanism, and then we allow you to kind of overweight things that you may want, and obviously Earth will choose today. And then now we look at the funds. And so we're working on ways to make this a little more easy to understand, but these below are the funds in Google's 401k. This is typical. Let me close this one because it's probably the least helpful. But for instance, Dodge & Cox stock is a popular fund in 401ks and it's a nice value fund. What we can expose here from the As You Sow is the fossil content of this fund. So we take the number from As You Sow, which you can get from their site, we embed it in here so that you can start to compare funds against each other and find them in that context. And then we also want to bring in other data from their site. For instance, I don't know, I guess I'm not supposed to make fun of Google. I guess Google thinks maybe 5% is approximately the amount of fossil fuel you should have. When we bring in guns, we'll find out what an appropriate amount of gun companies that I should own according to the fiduciaries over at Google. But anyway, my point here is actually Google tries to be a leader here. And this is their 401k. And this is the reality. This is why we need to take action together and move our money into these sustainable products to make them viable to put into 401ks so that we can get into full change of the holdings of people. So if you don't have a 401k or you want to build your own, then let me just try to get back to the beginning. So you can also build your own ultimate portfolio. In a 401k, you're obviously very restricted to their fund choices, but if you're just rolling over your IRA at Fidelity or wherever, you have thousands of choices, which is not necessarily helpful, and so that's something that we're also going to help. Good news is there's like 200 sustainable funds out there. You don't have to choose from 2,000, and most of them are reasonable choices. But what you can do is you can come through and look and build this up a piece by piece. You can look at funds and the fossil content of various funds. You can look at ratings that reflect you, and we're looking for ways to bring together the process of choosing funds and then looking at the ratings. And another thing that you can do is bring in predefined portfolios. So I know it's hard to find selections of funds, and guess what? People write about this stuff on newsletters and whatever. Here's a portfolio, so we'll just bring in these portfolios. Here's Morningstar's example, okay, bring it in. And so that you can see, well, how much guns do I get with that portfolio, right? And my hope is that advisors will come, put on free portfolios here for us to use, offer their services in addition for premium people who need advice, but there will be nice canned portfolios that have been defined at your asset class. You know, here's a health impact portfolio. There are specific funds that this advisor has curated that have kind of strong health ratings. And, you know, frankly, when you build a modern portfolio, these robo-advisors are putting 25, 30 funds into it, so eventually we'll help you build something that's really sophisticated. But the idea here is to help you build something simple. And we would appreciate, you know, anyone wants to give this tool a try. We're trying to make it helpful for folks. And just to, sorry, I have to show that these are connected to As You Sow. So when you click through on the fossil percent here, you can get into the As You Sow screens and all their details as well. And so that's the integration we're trying to provide.
And you'll be available in the lobby at noon with your computer and able to answer more questions for individuals. I want to introduce, or have Dave introduce, Claire Brown. I'm going to make my way to the appropriate screen. Huh? Thank you. Just getting there, getting there. Okay.
Claire Brown is an economics professor at UC Berkeley, where she teaches Buddhist economics. I can't tell you how happy I know that that even exists. To undergrads and development engineering graduate students, her work focuses on creating a sustainable economy that supports a meaningful life for all people. Her research teams focus on evaluating economic performance for California and for global economies, and on analyzing the financial risk of holding fossil fuel assets. Claire works with Fossil Free California and 350 Bay Area, where she focused her lobbying on passing SB 100. Governor signed yesterday. Yes. Please welcome Claire Brown.
I love being in a room full of well-intentioned people who, oops, I'm not sure how to pull up my slides. But I love being here, and also in San Francisco, everywhere. It's like wonderful having a week of activism and learning so that we can create the change we want and we desperately need. So, it's not here? Oh, hey, I had some really cool slides just to keep, I found this room really blurry and dreary, but hey. That's okay, we'll do without. I just had this great slide that's from my book trailer, Buddhist Economics. And you can go to BuddhistEconomics.net and you'll find the trailer. But it's an animation that a team down in LA made. But I just have this wonderful, one is like Trump squeezing the world to show you how the free market is to dominate the world, actually kill the world. so that we can consume more. And from a Buddhist perspective, we're all interdependent with each other and with the earth, and the well-being of all of us creates a well-being for me, and the well-being of the earth really determines the well-being of people. And so I've learned so much from working with this panel. And so one of the big messages that I have as an economist from a systems approach is that the whole message today, which we heard in great detail where we could really do it, is that in fact we have to all work together on two levels. We have to work individually to decide how we can use our resources to stop supporting fossil fuel and to create a clean energy and equitable economy. And one of the slides I wanted to show you is that the problems of inequality and the problems of fossil fuel emissions go together. And so that 10% of the richest people in the country, and not in the country, I'm sorry, in the world, and we're all in that 10%. We emit 50% of the carbon emissions. This is from an Oxfam report. The bottom 50% of people around the world are responsible for 10% of the carbon emissions. So inequality and carbon emissions go together. And those are our two biggest economic problems. So now's the time for us to really create and completely restructure the economy so that we create an economy that's sustainable and where we're caring for people and people's well-being. And we can do that. And today we're starting to talk about how we can do it as individuals and then how we can do it at the community level. And you can extend that out to policies. Economists know all the policies that help us reduce inequality and share prosperity. We've known them for decades. Not that we're politically doing them, but we know them. And we have bits and pieces around the world where it's happening, but we all need to come together and make it happen. We need the political will to reduce the inequality and share prosperity. And we also know how to reduce carbon emissions. We have all of those policies. Now let me tell you that yesterday, and these also all go together, and that yesterday I was at one climate event where we were talking about transitioning and staying under the 2-degree scenario, and they had somebody from Chevron, and by the way, I live by a Chevron refinery over in Point Richmond, so I know way too much about Chevron, but I also know about what it's like to live there, and to care for the children. So Chevron gets up and gives a song and dance that they all are giving, which is, hey, people want fossil fuels. We're just giving them the energy they need and demand. It's an essential part of their life. That's all we're doing. And so it's all laid on the demand side. There's no discussion of the supply side, except that, of course, on the supply side, all the big fossil fuel industries are quickly as they can, trying to get their reserves out of the ground and therefore into their assets and sold. And so you say, well, just a second, what about the carbon budget? You know, we have a carbon budget and you've got to keep a lot of this in the ground. But meanwhile, as we already know, they continue making investments that make no sense, that are financed by banks. And any economist who studies this will tell you, these are really stupid investments. They expect the return over a long period of time, and they're not going to get it. And so that question of why they keep doing it, it's like, when I talk to oil executives, they are just in another world. They truly don't think that they have to keep it in the ground, or that they're going to get it out of the ground in time. And you keep talking about the carbon budget, and they say, well, they talk about silver bullets. Well, as an economist, one thing I can tell you is there are no silver bullets. And what I loved about the panel today is there are lots and lots and lots of policies we can be doing and should be doing. And we need to do it in two ways once again. We need to individually live mindfully and have a low carbon footprint and make sure our assets are not supporting fossil fuel. But we mainly need to get off the sofa and do what we're doing today, which is come together and work with a group. I work with 350 and Bay Area, and I work with Fossil Fuel California, which I love. And it is so fantastic when you work really hard on like SB 100, I can't tell you how many thousands of activists around California were dancing all over the place when Jerry Brown finally signed it. And it is a big deal. It's historic. So my role actually is the final call to action. And so from a systems approach, we know that we don't want to support fossil fuels on the supply side, and that's where divestment comes in. When you're divesting, you're really reducing the supply of fossil fuels because you're making it too expensive. And you're really helping to keep it in the ground. And on the demand side, you have to really think about your own use, as well as where you put your assets. That's part of it. But it's really important. One of your biggest assets we didn't talk about today, and that's your vehicle. And you really do need to go electric or to really stop using your car as much as possible to help create livable cities and get out there and really work with your communities to create efficient buildings, livable cities, take public transit. I take BART as much as I can, although I do have an EV with 100% clean energy. I'm so grateful for MCE. And here's another Chevron story. A wonderful use of Chevron land is a solar farm. And so it's totally polluted. They can never use this land for anything. Except MCE got a really, really cheap rental price of the land and put up a gigantic solar farm. And so if you're ever driving around the Richmond Parkway by Chevron, look for it. It's the way we have to find a great use for land that's otherwise worthless and actually quite dangerous. But the solar farm doesn't care. And so let me just say, we know what to do. We know, thanks to the people today, how to do it, both from the elected officials all the way down to the engineer making new tools. Together, we can do it. Each and every one of us knows, just from the 30,000 people marching, that when we come together and we have all kinds of viewpoints, which is fine, we have all kinds of talents. It doesn't matter, there's no one silver bullet.
Sort of continuing on what Fred was saying, I really do want to say that, we talked about how when you break up with your bank, you can go in and let them know why you're breaking up. The other thing that I really enjoyed was going in and saying, here's why I'm breaking up, and you need to know that I'm part of a movement and that I'm working to get more and more people to break up as well. I'm talking to my neighbors, I'm talking to my friends, I'm talking to my colleagues, I'm talking to businesses to separate from you until you change your practices. So that's an important part of the discussion as well. Okay. Are there any other questions that have not made their way down here? Yeah.
There's one here.
Could I get a card?
I'm sorry.
Major banks and how bad are they? So basically the question is, are there any major banks that are better than others? I work for a large government agency, we research options, and have found that small credit unions can't provide the services we need in order for us to provide something to employees and vendors. And I think this is the kind of thing that the city of Berkeley is struggling with. It's one thing to say, yes, we want to separate, but the city of Berkeley has a large number of requirements that very few single banks can offer them. And this is one of the reasons that I know that there's a strong movement to support the public bank concept and why the public bank of Oakland is so important. But does anyone want to take a stab at whether the sort of do the least harm while still investing in a major bank that offers the services that a company thinks it needs?
Yeah, I can speak to that briefly. There's a bank, Bank of the West is owned by a French company, BNP Paribas. And Paribas has made some moves to cease investments in extreme fossil fuels. It isn't 100% clean, but it is beginning to bank, if you will, on cleaning up its image. It has a publicity campaign to that effect. And it's even getting some blowback from cities that rely on fossil fuels and saying that they're gonna pull their banking business if the bank's gonna clean up its act. So Bank of the West is one example of a fairly sizable bank that could be a candidate. I know that the cities that study where they're gonna put their their money, are faced with, requirements, a need for security, a need for collateralization, and they have to have a fairly sizable bank. The city of Davis was successful in moving to River City Bank because their contract with Wells Fargo was up at that particular time, and River City Bank actively courted them. So if you establish a relationship with a bank that wants your business, then that'll help grease the way.
Can I add a thought or two to that? This is a huge challenge. I don't think it's a challenge for individuals who are free to move their money anywhere they like, but for cities and larger institutions, it is a challenge. And one thing I didn't get to in my talk was the City of Seattle passed an ordinance saying it's not going to bank with Wells Fargo. About 2 or 3 months ago, it came time to renew its contract, and not a single bank bid on its contract. And so Seattle had a clause in its contract with Wells Fargo that if it couldn't get another bank, its contract automatically rolled over. So Seattle will be banking with Wells Fargo for the next 3 years, which means an additional $9 billion are going to cycle through Wells Fargo's accounts in the next 3 years, which I think speaks to the depth of the system change that we need to see, that our cities are so chained to Wall Street, irrespective of how unjust Wall Street's practices are. And we need to see real alternatives, which I know is why the public bank fights are so key. In Seattle, we've passed funding for a feasibility study that we expect to be completed in the next 2 weeks. A group of community activists are part of consulting with the consultant about that study, and I'm lucky to be one of them. But we need to be fighting for public banks, and just say one thing about why fighting for public banks is so important in terms of the climate fight. Free market, fundamentalist capitalism, neoliberalism is completely incompatible with this sort of rapid action and regulation on carbon emissions that we need to see on climate. And we need to really, to use an unfortunately violent metaphor, strike for the heart of neoliberalism, and that's the financial sector. And there can be nothing I can think of that's more likely to shake the fundamentalist free market form of capitalism that we've lived under in this country since at least Reagan, than major city institutions funding, creating public banks. And that really starts to change our meta-narrative in our society in ways that make action on climate much more likely.
Can I just say something about California public banks, take one sentence? Sure. If you all look up CPBA, California Public Banking Association, you find out that 6 or 8 major cities have already started, they're well underway, to creating public banks, CPBA.
I just wanted to add that Berkeley also had a similar issue as Seattle. They put out the RFP, and I think they got a few hits, but they weren't able to move all the money due to all kinds of reasons, but they are moving a little bit, like credit cards and things like that. And unfortunately, we did the same. We now have another 3-year contract with Wells Fargo, but we're also one of the cities investing in the public bank with Oakland and the other cities locally. Thank you.
The next question has to do a little bit about what we talked about. There are so many reasons to hate the big banks. It's hard to know which one to choose. Obviously, every one of us here in the room is focused on climate change and the environment and pipelines, etc. But someone pointed out that there are a number of divestment campaigns, not just the fossil fuel ones. Can you talk about the challenges in divesting from the war industry and the fossil fuel industry, focusing on differences, especially because the war industry is an expanding one. So this is something that Code Pink has really been involved in basically divesting from the war economy to a peace economy. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk about how partnering, all of these are interlocked, right? We've talked about sort of the intersectionality of this, but if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, As You Sow, which has provided fossil-free funds as a screening mechanism for finding out where your fossil fuel investments are, is also providing weapon-free funds. And it's based on data that will allow you to see whether, where and whether you're investing in weapons manufacturers. I think the phrase "knowledge is power" is really appropriate for bringing these wonderful data platforms to bear on your personal investments.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see, I see verticals, you know, we need to take sustainable investing from like a 2% adoption to 10% adoption, and then it's in our 401ks and everyone will have it. And in these verticals, there's climate, because this is very important, and there's guns. And guns resonates with a lot of people. And what I found was sustainable is that something's gonna bring you to it. It's not, and the other one is gender equality or equality in general. And so whatever brings you to the party, when you end up in sustainable or responsible funds, they tend to be giving you all of these features. And it's just a question of connecting, well, what don't you wanna own? Okay, you don't wanna own guns. Are you okay with not owning fossil? Okay, and so you kind of get a resonant solution there.
I just wanted to say that we also have to remember not to invest in the prison industrial complex. So that's also very important.
Excuse me, I asked a question, and one of the reasons I asked it is that when we're talking about the lessons from war, not just handguns and stuff, there's a political climate that is so pro-war in this country that we can individually divest, but when we're asking institutions to divest from the weapons manufacturers and the companies like BlackRock and stuff, that's a whole different, that's a very different thing than fossil fuels. So I'm just wondering if you could address some of the challenges that you see in divesting from war that go beyond investing in other evil things.
I mean, what I can say is, I've heard from someone in a more arcane divestment piece, which is BDS. And there are probably people in this room who are very violently opposed to BDS. So it's not kind of like a common progressive thing. And his message was, I can't get this through. I can't convince this university to care about this. But what I propose, what he proposes, is care about human rights. Put down general principles of what is appropriate. Put down policies, and it's amazing how these government organizations and universities look at their policy and go execute. So you just have to put down policies. They don't like very specific things, it annoys them, it's hard for them to work with. Come up with, and that would be my suggestion.
Thank you.
Yes, I personally stand up for human rights everywhere. I stand up for Palestinian rights, and I feel their struggle is our struggle. It's all the same. So we all have to invest and divest and be aware of how all that is all intersectioned, and it's all related in one issue, the human rights issue.
I'm sorry to say that we've run out of time. There are a lot of really good questions here. We'll try to get answers on there, but in the meantime, a big round of applause for our panel. And I'm going to actually quickly call Deborah Slovey up here. She'd like to make a brief statement, but Alec, can you also repeat your email for folks here?
Sure, it's Alec alec@350seattle.org. alec@350seattle.org.
Hi, I'm Chair of Fossil Free California, and I just want to thank you all for coming this morning and thank the panel. Fossil Free California has put a lot of effort into this, but I especially wanted to thank Sandy Emerson because she's the one who